channels here on Facebook and on YouTube. We are live on Zoom. We're going to give everyone a moment to join. We're going to open our Chumash today to page 124. Chumash, man. Okay, we are live. We're live on Zoom. We're just going to share it on two of our Facebook pages. Manny, remember the rules? We're here to learn. We're not here to disturb. Page 124. We are honored to have your presence, and your presence should respect the locale. Here we go. Two more shares. Good evening, Kayla Gittel. Good to see you all the way from California. Remember Kayla Gittel, Karen Donistek? Oh, Mick is coming into class.
Yo, what's up, Mick?
One more share. We're getting close. Oh, there we go. Jim is coming in. Good evening, Jane from Illinois. All our chevra are coming together. Beautiful. Who's that? Baruch said. Good. Baruch Hashem. Nu Habibi is right. Okay. We are on all our platforms and we are good to go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Parshas Chaye Sarah, the fifth portion in the book of Genesis and the book of Bereshis. We are talking about the life of Abraham and Sarah, and we transition into the life of Isaac and Rebekah. And at the end of last week's Torah portion, Abraham takes Isaac, his 37-year-old son, and brings him up to the Akedah to sacrifice him as per God's command at Mount Moriah. And of course, at the last moment, the angel on behalf of God stops Abraham from doing that, from sacrificing his son. And that begins our Torah portion this week. And that is that Sarah, Abraham's wife, at the age of 127, which back then was considered fairly young. Remember, Abraham lived till 175. Isaac lived till 180. Jacob lived till 147. So for Sarah to pass away at the age of 127, that was considered pretty young. But it says that the angel of death came to her, disguised as a human, and said, your son was taken up to be slaughtered at Mount Moriah. So she heard the news that her son was being slaughtered. She didn't hear the end of the news, which is that he was saved. She just heard that her son that she waited for and she gave birth to when she was 90 years old. Right now, she's 127. Her son is 37. He hasn't gotten married yet. He's still single because he only gets married in this week's Torah portion to Rebekah. So the dream of all dreams, the miracle of all miracles, was killed. And who was he killed by? Killed by her husband, Abraham. So she died of an instant shock, whether it was a heart attack, whatever it was, but it was from the shock. Now, Abraham is looking to find a burial place for his wife. He's in the land of Israel, in the land of Canaan. And if you look at the top of page 124 in the Life Chumash that we have over here, that we use every week, it says that Abraham was in the city of Hebron, and he says to the people, to the Hittites, the people living in Hebron at the time was a tribal nation called the Hittites. And he says to them, I am an immigrant and a resident among you. Let me have some land for a burial ground with you so that I may bury my dead in front of me. So he's talking to the Hittites, and he says, I'm a resident and an immigrant. Now, I know a lot of people are going to get excited because they think now we're going to have a discussion about immigration and about your resident and what kind of visa you can get. I am not. We're going to talk about Abraham using two different terms to express his being an inhabitant of this area. He's a resident and he's an immigrant. And how do you explain those two? And what was he really emphasizing? Right? Everything in the Torah is exact. So if Abraham uses both terms in Hebrew, ger v'toishav, I'm a ger, which means I'm a stranger, I'm an immigrant, and toishav, I'm a resident. Which one are you? Make up your mind, Mr. Abraham. You're trying to convince a group of people to sell you a piece of land. So Rashi says, the preeminent commentator on the Torah, Rashi says, Im tirtzu, if you guys want, meaning Abraham is telling the Hittites, if you guys want, then you could refer to me as a ger, as an immigrant. V'im lav, if you don't want to consider me an immigrant, eyet toishav, that I will remind you that I'm not an immigrant, I'm a resident. Ve'etlenu min adin, and I'll take my portion, which is owned by me inherently. So he gave them almost an option. Why? He said, God told me that this is going to be given to my descendants, the land of Israel. So if you'd like, you could consider me an immigrant, and you'll be kind enough, and you'll sell me a piece of land. But pay close attention. If you don't give it to me, I'll remind you that it really belongs to me, and I will take it as my own right. So there's two questions here. What I'm going to share with you tonight, I'm just going to say it up front, is a combination of two different talks from the Rebbe, one from 1969, one from, I think, in the 80s, and then there's a letter that the Rebbe wrote. It wasn't a talk, it was a letter that sort of fills in some of the pieces of what I'm about to share. It's a fascinating discussion. But there's two questions. Number one, if Abraham could have taken it legally because God gave it to him, why did he offer and eventually pay full cash for the property of the cave of Machpelah where he buried his wife Sarah? I mean, if I came and said this property belongs to me, I wouldn't pay cash for it. I would take it because it belongs to me. Huh? You know the answer?
Yeah.
What's your guess?
That it's a physical estate that cannot be taken away.
No.
Instead of just saying.
There's a non-Jew, a Hittite, sitting in Abraham's land of Israel. Abraham's coming. This is my land. Why are you paying full price for something that belongs to you already?
So to emphasize that it is,
you pay full price to emphasize. If your mother dropped your house with a sword, you don't have to prove anything.
Okay,
take a weapon and you take a sword and take your property back. It's yours. Why did he go and pay full cash value for a property that God gave him and to his descendants? And the second question is, if you look at the wording of Rashi, Rashi says, if you will, meaning Abraham's telling the Hittites, if you will, I'll be an immigrant, but if not, I'll be a resident. It sounds like Abraham's merit or ownership of the land is dependent on their will. So it's really the same question, but I'm separating it into two just to emphasize the need for clarity as to why not only was he paying full price, but sort of giving them the option to choose whether he should get it or not. It belonged to him, and he wanted to bury his wife, and he should have made that crystal clear that immigrant, schmimmigrant, resident, this is my land, have a good day, and I'm going to take it. Which forces us to have a healthy discussion about how the Jews own Israel. And I know since October 7th, we've always spoken about it here at this class, and since October 7th, there's been a lot of discussion that's associated with the current situation in Israel. And of course, what I'm about to say is indirectly connected to that, but it's not really where I'm going with it. I want you to understand from a Torah perspective, unrelated to what's going on in Israel today, just to understand how we own Israel. So let's do that. Jewish people's ownership of Israel is divided into two, I don't want to say segments, but two stages. You have the general ownership of the entire land, and then you have the individual ownership of parcels of land in the land of Israel. These two ownerships, the collective ownership of the Jewish people and the individual ownership of the particular parcels of land, came about through two acts of acquisition. In Halacha, as Seth and I have been studying in the Talmud, there's a very important thing in Judaism. To acquire something, it's not enough to verbalize it. You need to do an act of acquisition, and that depends on the particular item, whether it's real estate or something that's mobile or it's a cow. Every item has a different way of acquisition, but you have to do a symbolic act of where you're taking ownership. When we took ownership of the land of Israel, there was a collective ownership and there was individual ownership. The collective ownership, when did that take place? The acquisition of Israel as a collective people, that took place when the Jews entered Israel with Joshua, when they crossed the Jordan River, right? We finished the book of Deuteronomy just a few weeks ago, and then we go from Deuteronomy into the book of Joshua. Yehoshua, Moses' replacement, the one who took over Moses, right? The Talmud, the Medrash says that Moses was like the sun and Joshua was like the moon, who was a recipient of the light of the sun, and he carried the torch. Joshua leads the Jews into the land of Israel. When we conquered the land of Israel, those 7 years in which we conquered the land with Joshua, that was the act of acquisition in which we took as a people, as a nation, we took ownership of the land. What about the individual parcels of land? That only happened the next 7 years when the land was divided up for the tribes, and each tribe and each family got their particular ownership in the land, which is interesting because even though we inherited it, it's a Yerusha. Halachically, it's considered an inheritance. An inheritance, you would think that you don't need to have an act of acquisition. Nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe of Shneur Zalman, in his Code of Jewish Law says that Israel was given to every Jew as an inheritance, and even though it was given to us an inheritance, we had to have an actual forceful act of acquisition to take full ownership of it. That collective acquisition of Israel took place when Joshua helped us conquer the land the first 7 years, and then it was divided up into tribes and families within the tribes, and that was considered the act of personal acquisition of the particular parcels of land. And these two acquisitions, these two levels of ownership, individual and collective, are not dependent on each other. Meaning, there could be a situation where there's collective ownership of the land, and the Jews have it, and we've done an act of collective acquisition, but it hasn't yet been divided individually where each person owns a particular parcel of land. And by the way, the first 7 years would have been an example. We took acquisition of it collectively, but it took a whole nother 7 years until every tribe got their parcel, and yet it was owned, right? So, for example, when a king owns a land, when a king is not a president, but when a monarch is in control of a land, it doesn't mean that there can't be individuals who own pieces of land in the land, even though sometimes the king could take those lands away, right? So there could be collective ownership without individual ownership. But there can also be a situation where there's individual ownership of your particular parcel without collective ownership. For example, after the destruction of the first temple, who destroyed the first temple? Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. After 410 years of the Jews having the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem, and even though the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel and Amos and all the prophets that lived back then at the end of the era of the first temple were warning us that if we don't fix our behavior and we don't repent, we're going to be in trouble, Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys the first temple and takes the Jews to Babylon. Al Narais Bavel Sham Yeshavnu, the psalmist King David in Psalm says, we sat at the rivers of Babylon, Sham Yeshavnu Gam Bachinu, we sat and we cried, Bezochreinu Es Tzion, when we remembered Zion, right? We did this to ourselves, but we marched at the rivers of Babylon going into exile. But when he did that, according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, when Nebuchadnezzar kicked us out of Israel, we lost the collective ownership of the land. We got it during the days of Joshua, and according to the Rambam, hundreds of years later, when Nebuchadnezzar kicked us out, we lost not the inheritance. The inheritance is always there, but the practical acquisition of the land was lost. That's why this is called the second conquest, which happened with Ezra and Nehemiah, Nehemiah, and Ezra and Mordechai, when they after the 70-year Babylonian, Median, and Persian exile, when they went back, there was a second acquisition. But the original acquisition of collective ownership of the land ceased. When did it cease? It ceased when Nebuchadnezzar kicked us out. But it did not take away personal ownership of the particular family-owned properties. You can't take away particular family-owned properties. It belongs to the family. They paid for it. They own it. They inherited it. You could take away the Jewish people having their collective ownership, but you can't take the particular Jews, because before the exile, these Jews owned it. They acquired it in whatever way they did, and therefore their personal ownership was not connected to the general acquisition of the land by the collective. Right? I mean, the whole thing in America, I'm not an expert in the Constitution, nor do I want to be, but personal rights and personal land ownership, this is something that's debated every day in this country. If it wasn't for personal rights, we wouldn't need a Second Amendment, we wouldn't need a First Amendment. You don't have personal rights. In America, you can own your own land. That's why the whole debate about property taxes is so very powerful. Do I really own my land? Because the government can take it away from me if I don't pay my taxes on the property that I paid for already a long time ago. It's a very fascinating conversation. And it actually, some of it can very much relate to what we're discussing here, personal ownership versus collective ownership, and whether when you have personal ownership, whether it's fully yours or not. In Israel, in the Holy Land, there's both. There's collective ownership, personal ownership, and they're not mutually connected. They're not a guarantee that you're going to have both at all same time. So now let's go back to Abraham. Abraham comes to the Hittites. He needs a place to bury his wife, Sarah. His beloved wife of, 100 years, however long he was married to her, a long time, died unexpectedly from the news that I said earlier when she heard the news that Isaac was going to be slaughtered. And he needs to find his beloved wife of so many years a burial place. So he comes to the Hittites and says, listen, if you guys want, you can see me as an immigrant. Meaning, my plan right now is not to fully conquer the land in my rightful ownership. That's supposed to happen later. Now, Abraham knew it was going to happen later, but he said to them, I'm not planning on doing it now. All I'm looking for now is a parcel, not even a parcel of land. He said he just wants to purchase the cave of Machpelah, the actual cave, to bury his wife. If you will allow me to do that and give me the merit of burying my wife in this little parcel, not even a parcel, this little cave, then the general collective ownership currently, or leadership, or governance of this land will remain in your hands. And I'll just be an individual owner of this cave. But should you think that you won't give me a place to bury my wife, and I know, because I'm a prophet, that God wants her buried in this cave of Machpelah, that will be a sign for me that it's time for me to take my rightful ownership of this land by conquest. And therefore, I'm not only going to take my Ma'aras Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, I'm taking it all. Meaning, I'll come 1,000 years before Joshua, not even, whatever it was, a few hundred years before Joshua, and I will take it rightfully. Because Abraham knew that she was meant to be buried there, next to where Adam and Eve were buried, right? Because they were buried there first, Adam and Eve in the cave of Machpelah. So if you're not going to do it by your own will, right? That's why he said, if it's your will, I'll be an immigrant. If not, I'll become a resident, and I'll take it by. What he was saying to them was, I know she needs to be buried there. And if you're not going to willfully give me my personal parcel ownership of this cave, that's the greatest, it's not a threat. It was like he was saying, it's a sign for me. I will take it as a sign that it's time for me to conquer the whole land and take it as rightfully mine. So do yourselves a favor and give me the parcel, the cave that belongs to me. And of course, they ended up giving him not just the cave, but also the land beneath the cave, the field that it was on. And he paid a lot of money. Why? Again, because it was not time yet to take the land as a collective ownership. And therefore, of course, I'm going to pay for it. So there should never be a question about my personal parcel ownership of this particular land. So when we talk about just taking it to the modern state for a moment, to the modern reality, there's two reasons why Israel belongs to us. Number one, God gave it to Abraham and his descendants through Isaac. That's the collective ownership. But in addition to that, it happens to be that throughout history, the most prominent places in Israel that the Jewish people controlled and owned, like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which was bought by King David from Aravna the Jebusite, cash. Same term, chesef mole. It says the same term by David as it says here by Abraham, with full cash value. Since when do Jews pay full cash value? Since King David bought it from Aravna the Jebusite? Since Abraham bought it full cash value from Ephron the Hittite? Since Joseph bought it from Shechem and Nablus, he bought that area, the Mea Ksita with 100 Ksita. We're going to read about it in 3 or 4 weeks from now in the Parsha of Vayeshev. It's coming up soon. We're going to read in Genesis. We're going to read about when Joseph comes to Shechem, where his daughter was raped by Shechem, but over there he buys it in full cash value. So even if we don't own it collectively, even if you can come up with some babamaisa, some fairy tale in your head that the Jews don't own the land because of collective ownership, you can't take away the personal ownership, the fact that we paid for it in cash. Which really explains another interesting, everything is so detail-oriented. Rashi says that when Abraham was talking to the Hittites, he says, either you're going to accept me as an immigrant and give it to me. If you will, give it to me as an immigrant. If not, I'll take it as a resident and it belongs to me because God promised, God told me that I'm going to give it, that he's going to give it to my descendants. And so I'm going to come and take it. Hold on. Why did Abraham tell the Hittites a verse in which God promised to Abraham that he would give it to Abraham's descendants? God already told Abraham, there's two verses. There's one verse that says, Etenis Aretz Hazois, right? God told Abraham himself that either L'zaracha, to your descendants, I'll give the land, but he also told Abraham, L'cha etnen, I'll give it to you. There's one time where God tells Abraham, I'll give it to you. There's one time he tells he'll give it to his descendants. Why, when Abraham's talking to the Hittites about the land that he wants, the cave for his wife's burial place, does Rashi say that Abraham quoted the promise that God made to his descendants and not to him? And the answer is that when God promised it to Abraham's descendants, it was very detail-oriented with, in other words, Abraham wanted to prove to the Hittites that his ownership was from the collective ownership. Right? Because when God told Abraham initially he would get the land, he said, look, from the north to the south, to the east, to the west, it was talking about, hey, you're going to take the ownership of this entire land, but it was more about the Jews acquiring all the parcels, the individual parcels of land. It wasn't about collective ownership necessarily. But when God promised it to Abraham's descendants, it wasn't about the individual plots of land, individual parcels. It was about the collective ownership. And that's the message that Abraham was trying to give the Hittites. Personal ownership, yes, God promised that to me. And by the way, I could pay you a few dollars and buy this as personal ownership. And if you're willing to do that, I'm full game. I'm not looking to get collective ownership. But if not, there's a promise that God made my descendants. And that promise was that we are going to get collective ownership of the entirety of the land. And it's going to be acquired, not just as individual parcels, but as a collective place. So either give me my small parcel right now, or I'm coming to get whatever belongs to us collectively, and that will be an acquisition that really is supposed to happen in the days of Joshua, but we're taking it now. We're coming in early. Fascinating how simple, how many people read the verse? I'm an immigrant, I'm a resident, it sounds almost like hyperbole, like it's hyperbole. Basically, come on, guys, I'm one of you, I'm an immigrant, I'm a resident. But no, it's not just Abraham speaking with exaggeration or with human talk. He's sending a clear, absolute message to the Hittites. You have a choice to make. Play nicely, play ball, I'll pay you full cash value, but play ball and give me what I need for my wife, because that's where she's supposed to be buried. But if not, it's not a threat. It's a fact. It's a natural outcome. It's a sign from God that it's time for me to do what Joshua was going to do later, but I'm going to do it now, which is take what already belongs to us. So what the Rebbe says in the letter, which I think is very, very powerful, at least when I was learning it, I found it to be very, very eye-opening, is that something about this conversation between Abraham and the Hittite sounds a little off. Why? Abraham was a man of kindness. Everything about his life, his attribute was chesed. He was going around the world proclaiming God's oneness, teaching the world monotheism, feeding people, creating orchards and bed and breakfasts. He was all about sharing kindness.
Not giving this or
what?
Not giving me this or
correct. Not a threatening type of person, not a bombastic type of person. He was a persuasive type of person. So why in his first conversation about getting this cave for his wife's burial, does he immediately go to threatening or to warning that if you don't do this, at least let them say no first and then you can threaten them? But no, you say, listen, either you give it to me as an immigrant or I'm going to come and take it and because it belongs to me because God promised it to my descendants.
Without asking, without waiting for the answer.
Yeah. Why not try to be persuasive and, diplomatic? But this is where the Rebbe really, and the Rebbe said this in 1969 when it was after the 6 Day War. It was in between the 6 Day War and the Yom Kippur War. And the Rebbe was adamant of how we learn to deal with the neighbors to the land of Israel. With the Gentile neighbors, I don't care what religion they are. I don't care if they're Bedouin. I don't care if they're Druze. I don't care if they're Coptic Christians. I don't care if they're Muslim, Shia, Sunni. I don't care if they're Sufi, I could kill us. I don't care if they're Baha'i from Haifa. There's a certain way you have to deal with those who are not from the Jewish community who would like to claim interaction with the Jewish people. And that is as follows. When you have a demand of your neighbors around the land of Israel, or the neighbors, the non-Jews living in the land of Israel, the only language that they understand is you need to start with a forceful tone that makes it clear that you're not open for negotiations about this. Persuasion, what you call diplomacy, doesn't work. And some people say, oh, it doesn't work in the Middle East. You don't know the language of the Middle East, but it's not really just about the Middle East. It doesn't work when there's negotiations between Jews and non-Jews, especially as it relates to the land of Israel. There needs to be a level of clarity, of straightforwardness, of bluntness that's not up for negotiation. So when Abraham comes and says, I need a place to bury my wife, he could have, you're right, he could have tried saying, you know, guys, pretty please, my wife Sarah needs a place to be buried and I'm a nice guy. They don't understand that language. That opens it up for debate, the conversations, and before you know it, it's genocide and apartheid and ethnic cleansing and whatever other Baba Maisa they want to come up with. You can't open that door. You have to walk in kindly. Being bold and kind is not mutually exclusive. You can be bold and kind simultaneously. Abraham showed us by his role modeling that when you're dealing with the ownership of the land of Israel, when you're dealing with a Gentile nation who doesn't really understand the modus operandi, the way that Jews operate, you cannot just be diplomatic. You cannot just be a sweetie pie. You can be kind, you can be benevolent, but you must be bold and say the truths boldly. What's the truths? This land belongs to me. You want to sell it to me? I'll purchase it from you. You don't, I will remind you that the entire land collectively belongs to us because God gave it to me and my descendants. And now what is it you would like to talk about? Now that I got that out of the system, what is it you wanted to say? And at that point, what you end up happening, just like what happened with the Hittites, what did they say? Absolutely, Abraham, you can have your land. When you show boldness, it doesn't actually create war, it creates peace. They end up saying, you know what, with pleasantness, with peace, as you said, we'll give in to what you asked. That so much so that Ephron, the Hittite, ends up saying, you know, I'm not only giving you the cave, I'm giving you the land beneath it. So it has to be two things have to happen at the same time, and it's not a contradiction. You have to be utterly respectful. We're not a disrespectful people. There's nowhere in our faith, there's nowhere in Judaism that ever allows or encourages a Jew to be disrespectful to any other human being, because every human being is created in the image of God. We will offer to pay, we offer respect, but don't ever make the mistake of thinking that our respect means that we're weak or meek. We'll pay you because we're a respectful people. We treat every human being with dignity. But we will let you know boldly and clearly that this land is not up for negotiation. God gave it to us. And that's what needs to be said at the UN. That's what needs to be said at the Pentagon, at the State Department, at the Congress, both houses of Congress, in every state and every governor in every country around the world. We are Jews, and as Menachem Begin said, we're not weak-kneed Jews. We're done trembling at the knees. We have nothing to tremble and fear. We have nothing. God gave us a land. Righteous people of all faiths know that. Evil people of all faiths choose not to know that. And it's our job to not be some diplomatic yo-yo because we want to make everyone happy. You know what the world likes more than anything? Bold Jews. Respectful, bold Jews who say the truth with respect and dignity. They're even willing to pay cash for it. Right? That's why it says, for example, right here in our Torah portion, it says, that they bow to the people of the land, to the Hittites. The simple understanding is that Abraham bow to them like as a respect, which was the tradition. You bow your head to them, right? He was thankful. But our sages say that he was actually bowing to God. And from here we learn that when you get good news, you should always bow to God. And is it really a contradiction? No. You could say both. He bowed to them to thank them because he wanted to be respectful. And he also bowed to God because he recognized that by him showing his boldness to the Hittites, that was recognizing really his trust in Hashem, which is how a Jew is supposed to operate. Being respectful does not mean you bow out of your religion or you hide or you kowtow to whoever's selling you some crock on the media about Israel or the Jews, or you think they're going to like you more if you throw your fellow Jews under the bus. That's always worked. From the Holocaust to the Inquisition, it's always worked when you throw Jews under the bus. I'm joking. Of course, it never works. It works for 5 minutes till they come after you. The world has respect for those who respect themselves. But you say, well, Rabbi, I respect myself and there's these anti-Semites on the internet. Yeah, I'm not talking about animals. What do I mean by that? There are human beings that act like human beings. There are human beings that act like animals. And that could be of any faith. It's not a specific group of people. Sane, healthy, moderate, stable human beings respect Jews who respect themselves. What does it mean for a Jew to respect themselves? It means to be bold and respectful simultaneously. Show other people respect because they are human beings and maybe they have a different way of seeing the world, but also be bold in what it is we believe in, who gave us this land. When you do that, the world comes right with you to hold your hands. And so Abraham taught us by his example, there's nothing wrong for paying for a parcel of land. There's actually an organization in New York, it's called Ateret Kohanim. They've been doing this now for probably, I want to say 30, 40 years, maybe more. It's not a Chabad organization, it just happens to be a group of Jewish philanthropists in New York. They raise money and they buy up homes from Arabs in the old city of Jerusalem and they take ownership of it. They could take it by force, but we don't. We raise money and we pay for it in cash. And certain groups go crazy. They're trying to, what do they call it today? Appropriate the land. No, they're buying back the old land. The old belongs to us. We're being gracious and respectful. We're reappropriating it with cash. And it's being sold legally and documented and everything. You know what? It seems beautiful to me. Because we could take it by force because it's ours. We choose not to because we're respectful people. So you can be bold, smart, and respectful simultaneously. And the result is only to the betterment of the Jewish people. So my message to you, my dear friends, tonight, don't be a weak-kneed Jew. There's enough of those out there. They don't know where they stand. They want to impress their non-Jewish girlfriend or their boyfriend, which maybe that's part of the original problem. But that's not who we are. We are people that are bold. We are people who are smart. And we are people who are expected by God to be respectful and treat everyone with dignity. And when we do those three things properly, like Abraham did, we end up not just with the cave of Machpelah, but we end up with the land beneath it. We end up with a world that's willing to give us what we ask for because they respect those who respect themselves. And we don't end up in a world where Jews are ready to sell their brothers and sisters out for $1.99. And so it is not complicated. I mean, people that pontificate for a living and get paid by Fox and MSNBC and CNN, they get paid to pontificate. So they can pontificate. They get paid to make things that are simple sound complicated. And then they could give their deep logic about it. Correct. They have to spend time on nothing. It's really very simple. It's ours collectively. It's ours individually. We will be happy to pay so that it's ours individually. And if that doesn't work, we're happy to come and say, remind you that collectively belongs to us. And Abraham paved the way for us. So let's internalize the first Jew, the first patriarch of the Jewish people, Abraham, the way he buried the first matriarch Sarah, and let's show the world what bold, respectful, and wise, brilliant Jews look like, because that's a world that's a lot more peaceful, a lot more healthy, and one that's filled with a lot more respect. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Whoever said over there, I saw somebody wrote in the comments, let me see where it is over here. It was a while ago. Oh, Davida. She said, thank you. I read your article. You're very welcome. The 5 Towns Jewish Times. Have a wonderful evening. We're going to stop the live feed. We'll see you back here next Wednesday, God willing. Yep, it's the night before I head to New York for the Rabbis Conference, but I will be here next Wednesday. Look forward to it. Have a wonderful evening. Be inspired, be uplifted, and be illuminated. We'll see you later.